World Insight coming to you from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, People Mountain, People Sea. That's how the Chinese would describe the site of major tourist attractions during the 7-day national holiday. And as China continually takes the top spot for the number of tourists overseas, we must ask, what will this mean for the global economy and that of China's? And what does it take to be a China hand or an expert in Chinese affairs? For a man like Robert Daly, in almost 30 years of diplomatic relations, opportunities, and even a stint on television. Early October is always an exciting time for the Chinese. The week-long National Day holiday is the best time for travel. Domestic areas of interest always packed with crowds, and overseas scenic spots receive more Chinese than any other time in the year. It is a well-established trend that the Chinese people are traveling the world in large numbers with an impressive capacity for overseas shopping. With all that in mind, what does this expenditure mean for the global economy and that of China's?
Crowds, crowds, crowds. A sea of people is a common sight during the National Day holiday. That's why more and more Chinese are turning to the alternative, overseas travel.
Overseas travel is very popular during the National Day holiday this year, with an increase of 40% compared with last year.
For most, traveling overseas is more than just a relaxing trip. Shopping is an important component. China has the fastest growth rates of overseas purchasing in the world. According to retailers in the US, Chinese tourists usually purchase more than twice as much as other international visitors.
France has a high standard of quality, unlike the various levels of standards back in China.
You don't have worries about buying fake goods.
In 2015, the Chinese made 120 million trips overseas, up 9.8% from 2014. China ranks top in the world for both the number of travelers and the amount of overseas shopping expenditure.
This means that the Chinese economy has entered an era of transformation. Consumption pushes the growth of not only China itself, but also of other countries which have good and popular products.
Many travelers make use of their time overseas to learn more about the foreign market, so as to make better decisions about their investments. However, what Chinese policymakers see from the fever of overseas tourism is an urgent need to push a supply-side reform of the domestic travel industry and to meet increasing travel demands. And seeing the crowds this holiday, it looks like this travel trend is going nowhere but up in the long run.
And for some discussion on China's tourism and investment abroad, we are joined here in the Beijing studio. Ms. Zhang Mei, who is the founder and CEO of Well China and also author of the book, Travel Through Dali with a Leg of Ham. Welcome. And also Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, Professor. Yes. In Tokyo, we're having Mr. William Saito, Special Advisor to the Japanese Cabinet and also founder of Intercur, that's an international technology consulting firm. In New York, we are joined by Professor Max Wolf, Professor of Economics from New School University. Welcome to all of you. We've got a strong panel over here. But first of all, I want to start with the other two guests coming from the US and Japan, because everybody wants to have a share of the dragon dollar, Mr. Saito. Chinese tourists going to Japan in massive amount. What does it mean really for your tourism and the overall economy even?
I think that it'll definitely change things here where we're all very excited. Japan has changed visa entry requirements and there's more duty-free shopping that for the first time since 1970 there are more inbound tourists than outbound tourists. So there's a big change here and we're all very much looking forward to it.
What about you, Professor Wolf? In New York, so many Chinese tourists.
Yeah, so certainly in New York, definitely in Miami, definitely in San Francisco and Los Angeles. It's been a really important support for a lot of local businesses. And I think we're beginning to learn how to best serve increasing numbers of Chinese tourists who generally see the traditional tourist things and do the traditional tourist activities, but have their own unique opinions and their own desires. And I think we're beginning to articulate an industry to meet those needs and desires.
Yes, indeed. It's not just Japan, not just the United States, but European capitals and also many other Asian countries, even African countries, Latin American countries. Ms. Zhang, you've been doing China's outbound tourism. Tell us how competitive are these destinations for Chinese tourists?
Oh, very competitive. You look at the tourism board. How many of them come to the Chinese tourism trade shows? It's incredible. Yeah.
You see so many promotions right before the National Day holiday. Everybody wants to have a share.
Absolutely, and you see billboard ads.
Yeah, but exactly what attracts Chinese tourists?
Chinese tourists are looking to learn from a different culture. You know, traditional Chinese saying, 衣食足而知礼义. They always, once you are well fed, you have enough wealth, you're curious about the world. I think there is an intrinsic curiosity that's driving Chinese around the world.
And do you see that trend, Professor Liu? What does it mean? How much money we have to spend overseas?
Well, we still have a very high savings rate, and particularly now, if we cannot afford to buy a house now in Beijing, then why don't we tour around? So that's affordable expenditure. And the other is that, yes, the Chinese people are there to open their horizon, not only for curiosity and for sentimental satisfaction, but they are also there to learn. You know, what other commodities could sell well overseas, so they look for business opportunities in the meanwhile. Of course, the ostentatious consumption is always, you know, another driver for people. Okay, I bring the top-notch brands back at home to show to my friend circle, and now WeChat. So, you know, there are a lot of needs for it.
Okay, but Ms. Zhang, is shopping really the top priority for Chinese tourists?
I think it has been, but it's changing.
How?
Traditionally, Chinese loved going overseas to buy all the big brands because it's either tax-free or it's at lower cost and it's really trustworthy quality. But nowadays, honestly, the ones who have shopped enough and the more sophisticated travelers are maturing at a rapid speed and they are looking to experience the world.
Give us some examples. I mean, you've been doing outbound tourism for a long time, bring them to exotic places. Help us to understand, what are their changed interests?
Okay, one example. A few years ago, the top product probably would be a 20,000 RMB, which is a little less than $3,000 trip for 15 days covering the entire North America. Okay, you just count all the cities, list all of them, Seattle to New York to Montreal to Toronto. And
it's about photo op rather than anything else.
It's a checklist, right? I want to visit as many cities as possible and as economically as possible. But now, this coming October holiday, I have a group of people climbing up Kilimanjaro, 10 of them.
Wow.
And in preparation for that, they have been taking physical exercises, go to fitness classes, and the desire to say, I am not traveling to show on my WeChat that I've been to New York. That actually sounds kind of passé. Instead, they want to challenge themselves, go experience the world, go experience the culture.
All right, Mr. Saito, how many of those Chinese tourists going to Japan are challenging themselves? How many of them are actually looking for rice cookers and even toilet seats? Just to use two anecdotes.
Yeah, I think that I think that we see a distinct change, that it's changing from huge buying of quantities of brand goods to really, just like it was mentioned, a lot of experiences and services. I think what we're also seeing a trend is that it's less the single, for example, ladies that will come, but there's a greater trend for more families that come to Japan, and I think that there are more seniors and elderly people who come, so they have different needs where they're not necessarily buying things as much. And then the key thing that I think from a Japan perspective that we see just in the last few months that are changing is that maybe a year or two ago there would be huge masses of people in tours buying large quantities of products. But when they go back, they realize that they can actually buy these Japanese products online, and so they get their really tastes in terms of wanting to buy things online, and they go a lot now for Japan for the experiential reasons and out of the metropolitan areas. So I think we're definitely seeing a shift even in the last year.
Professor Wolf, of course, for the city of New York, which you are in right now, there's just so many things to explore. It, of course, could be about taking photos and checklists, as Ms. Zhang just said. It could also be about entertainment, about food, about culture, about diversity. Do you see a change of taste also among Chinese tourists going to your country now?
That are coming here are more affluent and more sophisticated, so it isn't a first trip to America or even maybe a first trip outside China. It's really about having unique experiences. So I think shopping is still quite popular as an activity here in New York, particularly with tourists from outside the US and Chinese included, but I think we see more and more people going to the ultra high-end boutiques and trying to get one-of-a-kind products as opposed to trying to get Me Too brand identified products. And I think there's much more of a taste for experiences, whether those are the boutique, unique hotel experiences of New York City, or renting a boat and going on a tour of the harbor, or driving out. And there's also still a significant amount of real estate tourism here, where people are coming to New York City as tourists with at least the prospect of purchasing property as part of the motivation.
Yes, indeed. How many of those? What is likely to be the proportion, Professor Liu, for Chinese going overseas? Well, they're traveling as tourists, but at the same time looking at the opportunity for purchasing properties if they cannot buy a condominium in Beijing.
Yeah, I think the transition was from initially photo taking, then to shopping, and then to experience. It shows the increasing confidence and sophistication of the Chinese tourists overseas. As to the proportion, I would say that those who look for either property or to business opportunity or shopping for schooling for their children. So they take, I would arbitrarily say, a quarter of the whole population, tourists visiting overseas.
Just the upper middle class here in China, you can't imagine how many of them are traveling to the United States, Japan, and UK to see their kids who are in the school over there. It's amazing. But having said that, though, there has always been a gap, particularly in recent years, between Chinese expenditures overseas and foreign tourists spending in China. It is ever widening. 2015, the year, Chinese tourists spent over $100 billion overseas, half of which was used for shopping. In comparison, foreign tourists only spent a total of nearly $60 billion in China. So what can we make of this gap, Ms. Zhang? And also, what does it say about China's own tourism industry? Is it getting ever weaker? I mean, do you feel that foreign tourists coming to China spending ever less, while Chinese tourists just bring out their wallet and spend just like that?
Well, I think foreign tourists coming to China has stayed relatively flat with a small, 2-3% growth rate, which is not that bad for other countries, but in comparison to the extraordinary growth of Chinese overseas, it pales, absolutely. And what it tells me is I started while China taking foreign travelers coming to China.
Yes.
So I see this first-handed. I think Chinese, for a couple of reasons, foreign tourists are coming, fewer are coming. Number one, the air quality. What blankets the news on New York Times is always the air quality, but we need to do a better job to tell people China is so big. There is Yunnan province and there's Guizhou where you can have beautiful air, right? And a second thing is the Chinese tourist industry development tends to follow a similar path. Whenever they say we forge a tourist site, the experiences don't differentiate strongly from each other. And over time, people kind of say, what's the point of coming back again? That is the third reason. And thirdly, I think nowadays people's decision to travel is influenced by peers through social media, through beautiful, inspired by pictures. Right. But they can't send an Instagram when they are on a trip in China, which makes it a little difficult.
I see. Professor Liu, what do you say? I mean, do China's tourism industry, does it really care how many foreign tourists are coming into China, or the domestic market is already big enough for the domestic consumers that all they have to do is to make sure the Chinese tourists are happy? That would be fine.
Well, I think that's really a sort of ethnocentric approach, because as really a famous tourist site, if you only see homogeneous domestic tourism, you think is really striking on the low end. So I think with more of the cultural diversity, with noses of different size, you really see that it is really robust with global flavor. And I think one thing I mentioned about the homogeneity. The other, I think, the even outstanding issue is how do we really improve the management? So many tourist attractions actually are controlled by local villagers or by local towns, and they do not really see the real need of global travelers. For example, I just repaired my part of the Great Wall with new bricks, and they see, well, I set up something very, very new and very convenient. But tourists really wanted to see, what is the true face of the Great Wall from 2,000 years ago.
Right. Well, of course, that's a big debate going on in China. That is how to preserve the culture and understand our culture better to even present it to ourselves as tourists.
Yes.
Having said that, though, what is also interesting is Chinese going overseas. We talk about the mentalities facing China's own domestic tourism, but also when they are going overseas, what have been the behaviors and habits of Chinese tourists? Are their tastes, because of the massive amount of shopping and spending they're likely to do, going to change the kind of services and the specialties of tourism worldwide? Let me go to you, Professor Wolf, for your opinion.
Yeah, so I think we've already started to see this. I have some relatives and have for many years spent time in the summer in Greece, which is a very small country. But I've already seen Santorini, one of the more famous places that you'd go to in Greece, become a destination wedding spot for younger Chinese folks who now represent a significant portion of the people in town. And the town has sort of reconfigured itself in part of Santorini in order to be friendly to the photographic desires and needs of young newlywed couples coming from China. I think that's a very big example of it, only because Greece is quite small and Santorini has become quite popular. But I think versions of that are developing all over New York City. And given the growth of the Chinese economy, given the shift of China to a consumer economy, and given the growth of airlines and airliner purchases, we should expect a whole lot more of this in 1 year, 5 years, and 10 years.
Are Chinese going to flood the streets of Tokyo and many other cities? Mr. Saito, on the one hand, you need $1 from the Chinese tourists, but on the other hand, how can you deal with the traffic?
No, and I think you see that already. Even without the large holidays, on a given weekend, there are a lot of tourists. What's interesting, though, is that the amount of effort, even for Japan, to make it tourist-friendly, that even having English signs in the rural areas is a new thing, but to quickly follow on that with Chinese signs. And what's interesting is etiquette rules in many languages. But what I find fascinating is you go to one of the larger department stores in Tokyo, and the staff there are actually more Chinese-speaking and staff from China than there are Japanese ones now. And so this is becoming an issue and debate to a certain extent.
Are Chinese going to reshape the international tourism? Change all the tastes?
In sheer volume, yes. Actually, yes.
Yeah, but what about the content of tourism?
Both good and bad. There is the good part. I think the service providers, as the previous speakers have mentioned, become much more international. The hotels now come equipped with hot water kettles, slippers, which Chinese travelers must have.
Right.
And you can even find stir-fried over rice at Jasper National Park. And these international
porridge is available
standards,
in all the breakfast around the world.
yes, yes, those are great. But at the same time, mass package Chinese tour groups have a reputation to drive the industry profit down to very, very, very thin. For example, the package prices require the lunches to be at, I don't know, $5 or $10 per meal. And it creates a lot of pressure, and all these suppliers are in it for profit as well. Will it create a made for China kind of industry service standards overseas is something that worries me from an industry standpoint.
I see. Professor, is that likely to change with the Chinese and more money, the mindset change?
I think yes, definitely. I think this is a very quick learning process for China. From curiosity now to more sophistication in the tourism, and their taste will also change. And plus that the catering for the Chinese tourists is also changing. Right now, we really can have a taste of authentic Chinese food anywhere in the world. In American restaurant, you have less ketchup, at least in those right. Chinese food, and you definitely see more of the Chinese signs in all the casinos around the world. Right. Wow. So the ushers and the service people can speak ni hao xie xie and all those types of Chinese right. to greet the Chinese customers.
But I'm talking about the mindset and the taste of the tourists. Ms. Zhang, how do you think it can be done for the future to better the taste of the Chinese tourists, to make them understand what are the most important and most precious when it comes to traveling? How would they become more global trekkers rather than just someone who take photos every time they get off from the bus?
I think it takes two to tango. From the traveler side, it is a natural process of maturation. For example, in the United States, there was a famous movie that says, "In the night, if it's Tuesday, we must be in Belgium." That was American travelers, flooding to Europe, right? And China's mass tourism is
and
at that stage.
Japanese tourists also experienced that period of time.
Exactly, went through the same thing. But just continue to travel, and people will quickly come to realize, actually, when I travel, is it absolutely necessary I have a Chinese meal, or it makes more sense to taste a local Moroccan meal? And in fact, there is a fast maturing, more high-end tourists crowd, or travelers I'd rather call them, because they spend more time to really travel and discover. We have some going to Morocco for food. They don't want a single Chinese meal.
Just food. That's it.
Just food.
I would expect that in the next stage for the Chinese tourists to get more matured, they spend more time in those museums, in those libraries, instead of taking photos with landmark buildings on the street.
And it's already happening. It's already happening, Professor, by the way. Yes. And before we go, I'd like to give 30 seconds also each to the other two panelists with us in Japan and also in the United States. We see this huge competition for Chinese tourists from around the world. On the one hand, cultivate the taste of Chinese tourists. On the other hand, make sure that the services are to their needs. This is a very delicate balance. Mr. Saito.
No, I think it's a delicate balance, but what I find interesting the last few years is the market is actually pretty self-correcting. That the last example, for example, where we take large tours and bring them to Japan, these obviously cause problems not only for the shopkeepers, the general area, but the people who are actually on the tour. But there's also a taxation issue, and so there are more emphasis being placed on the quality of these tours, and I think that helps out the market and also the people who are on the tour. So the market is actually self-correcting, and it's just a matter of time where it just gets better.
Can we just trust the market, Professor Wolf?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have to for the short term, but I do think that the tourism does something else that's very important, both for Americans and Chinese in this example, which is people need to be exposed to each other and have each other be demystified. In an era defined by increasing threats to globalization and global comparison, meeting and seeing people, whether you're the traveler or the host, is an important to solidify the bonds that our global economy requires to survive.
Max Wolf, William Saito in Beijing, Ms. Zhang Mei, Professor Liu Baozheng. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's wish everybody have a great National Day holiday. Thank you so much for being with us. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. A diplomatic position, a stint of television, and the countless opportunities. What does the Chinese journey of the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States look like? I speak with Robert Daly on his time in China, as well as his connections to the country. You're watching World Insight on CCTV. There is no better way to be in the heart of the Chinese than playing a leading role in one of the most popular sitcoms. And that is exactly what Robert Daly, a young American scholar, did back in the early 1990s in a television series entitled A Native of Beijing in New York. He spent a year with the Chinese crew who, for the very first time, filmed overseas. Never did they expect their show to become a national hit, but thinking back, of course, it did. The series dealt with one of the most popular themes for the urban Chinese back then, what it was like to live in a foreign country. Could they achieve their dreams overseas? For Robert Daly, his dream did not stop at being the most familiar foreign face for Chinese TV audience, but how to play his role in China-US relations throughout his career. I caught up with him in Beijing recently. Before he tells us his fascinating stories, let's delve a bit more into his history.
In 1987, China was Robert Daly's first station outside the United States. At that time, young Daly was sent to China as a diplomat at the US Embassy. And over the next 4 years, Daly began to cultivate much interest in China. He went back to the US in 1991 and started teaching Chinese at Cornell University. In 1992, Daly received a phone call at midnight. He was offered a role in a Chinese television series titled A Native of Beijing in New York. Daly was casted as David McCarthy, the owner of a clothing factory. And for someone who has never been in front of the limelight, it was hard for him to say no to such an opportunity. Broadcast in China in 1994, the TV series was an immediate hit. And even today, many Chinese still recognize Daly from the series. In the following years, Daly traveled between China and the US, promoting cultural exchanges. He even helped produce the Chinese version of Sesame Street. And in 2001, Daly became the American director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center, a joint venture between Johns Hopkins University and Nanjing University. In 2013, he became the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Daly devoted his career in promoting the ties between China and the US. And after all these years, it's safe to say that he is a China hand through and through.
David, I think that
Right.
role's name is, in the earliest TV series China made overseas in the United States. It's called A Native of Beijing in New York.
Right.
What was that experience like?
Well, that was fascinating.
A long time ago.
It was 23 years ago.
Oh, wow,
It
time
was a little
flies.
strange because I went from being not only a diplomat, but a cultural diplomat who was working on cultural and educational exchanges, trying to, project overall a positive image of the United States in China, to being in this program which doesn't paint an altogether bleak picture of the United States, but it's, I think it's fair to say, a somewhat bleak picture. And I was doing that as part of a Chinese production crew, very much under Chinese leadership, the leadership of our directors. And so there was a challenge in doing that. I don't think the directors really intended in many ways to paint quite as bleak a picture as they did. There were two factors that contributed to that sort of the gray, gloomy feeling of A Native of Beijing in New York. As you say, it was the first Chinese production that was shot in America. I think the Bank of China made, as I recall, a $1 million loan. And so that meant they didn't have much money. So time was money. You had to shoot fast. Well, it just so happened that they filmed the entire thing in the winter in New York. And that's why it's always sort of gray and dismal, and there's so much that's indoors. It was freezing cold. It was winter, and if you pay attention to the background, I don't really remember, but I think A Native of Beijing in New York was supposed to happen over 10 years. But it's 10 years in which it's always winter.
That's right.
And it's very frequently Christmas, if you pay attention to the decorations in the background. So and that wasn't something the directors intended. That was just the calendar.
Right.
And then the other factor, the character I play is not a very good guy. He's sort of money-grubbing.
Selfish,
he's kind of self-absorbed. He's somewhat exploitative. But there was never an intention to portray an American that way. That part that I played was originally called Mei Wei-ping and was played by a very famous Chinese actor, Chen Daoming, a Shanghai actor, played that part. And the script said that this was a Taiwanese. So it was a mainland fantasy about a Taiwan businessman in America depicted by this very great actor, Chen Daoming. But he left the production after about 3 weeks, and I was what the Chinese call a meo banfa, a banfa. They had to find somebody very quick. And so I had the good fortune, Zhang Wen was an old friend, and I think basically he said, well, I know an American who can speak some Chinese. So they pulled me in. So there was never an intention to depict this character as American. Not at all.
It just happened to be.
It just happened to fall out that way, and it wasn't something the directors intended.
But for China and many of the Chinese audience, that TV series was quite special.
Right.
Because that was, for many of them, a very first glimpse to what they perceived as the United States, or Chinese in the United States. What do you make of it?
It was the first time a Chinese crew had gone and shot. I think they did at least as good a job as an all-American crew coming to film a show in China at that era would have done in portraying China. So these guys were the pioneers. As I say, I think it was a little bit too bleak. It was a narrow look at China. It was, I mean, a look at the United States. And again, its focus wasn't really on the United States per se. The question was, what is the United States like for Chinese who go there?
That's right.
That was the real question, not what is the United States like. And from that point of view, I think that we have to say they did a pretty good job for the era. I think the one decision they made that might have been confusing for some Chinese viewers is there was a little bit of confusion between the experience of legal immigrants to the United States and illegal immigrants to the United States. So I think that if you suggest if there was an inaccuracy in the native of Beijing and New York, it was in the confusion of those two experiences.
Many of your Chinese friends or people even now walk onto the street, they would recognize your face.
Right.
It's interesting that you're getting quote-unquote famous in a very different culture.
So that was, and that's been very helpful in the long term. Because frankly, in the job that I'm in now, directing the Kissinger Institute, we work with a lot of high-level, very high-level Chinese leaders, almost all of whom really have seen the show. And so it's a very good icebreaker. Because they've seen me from the show, and so there's already a connection of sorts. And
what was it like for you, I mean, as a diplomat to begin with, now, I mean, then became an actor and play a role, and you're a main character, I have to say.
Right, I was sort of the #2 American lead to Zhang Wen, right?
What was it like? Were you scratching or?
It was, I'm not an actor. This is not my native language. I had not read the script. I didn't really know what was going on. I was making it up one day at a time. And then it was, of course, it was intimidating because I was acting opposite, Zhang Wen, who, it's not that he's a great Chinese actor. He's
very charismatic.
He's one of the greatest actors in the world. I mean, he's a first-rate actor. And although he was a good friend of mine, that doesn't qualify me to act with him.
Did you got some tricks already eventually?
Tricks, I got some good advice. Zhang Wen himself was very helpful. Feng Xiaogang, most of my scenes were shot with Feng Xiaogang as the director. And he was also very patient as well as a good teacher. He's a very talented director as well as a good actor. So he was also very helpful. And then I had some friends in America who were professional acting teachers who gave me some advice over the phone, but I was making it up on the fly. And I watched it once when it came out in 2003, and I just can't stand it.
Were you nervous?
Oh, it's awful. The experience of watching my own scenes was fairly hellish.
What do you mean? Others really liked it.
Yeah, but the Chinese are very generous in their assessments, and I think, pretty clear-eyed about my abilities, which are fairly low in this department. So I got through it, but I watched it once 23 years ago, and I haven't watched any of my own scenes since then.
A television series can only do so much to reflect the changes of a mindset and aspirations of a country, especially one as vast and diversified as China. According to Robert Daly, it takes generations to understand the overall and ever-evolving picture of China. And even though his knowledge and depth of analysis about China might be limited, as he said also that his fascination with the country, culture, and people will always remain limitless. One can tell it is a topic of great passion as he reflects on his personal and academic experiences in China. You were in China 1980s, 1990s, the early 21st century as well. How has China changed in your eyes?
Well, I don't know that my eyes are very important to China's changes, but I think that change really has been the big theme. It's been astounding to see from '87 when I first got here when, even though the Cultural Revolution had been over for quite some time, you could still feel that sense of what Cultural Revolution in China was like at street level in Beijing. That was still the dominant feeling in the way that people dressed, in the way they act. People still wore the ganbufu, what we call the Mao jacket, everywhere, and the kinds of explosive development we'd see later. There was no sign of that, really. Beijing was a slow, sort of quiet city, very charming. It was sort of lovely in its way, but a long ways from anything like modern development. And to go from that, almost 30 years later, to a city in which we're sitting in this famous building that CCTV has built, which is only one of many stunning buildings in the Chaoyang area, and in which Beijing, China, is full of billionaires and luxury vehicles. It's a huge change.
Is that a change that you would like to embrace?
I don't exactly embrace it. One of the changes that I've seen is a real emphasis on consumer culture and consumerist values in China, which is very understandable. And certainly the material well-being of the Chinese people has greatly improved. We see health outcomes, educational outcomes, all far better. And that's a great thing for the people of China. I do miss, I confess, in the late 80s there was an idealism in China and an interest in ideas and culture. If Milan Kundera's books were about to be published, everybody knew it and they wanted to read Kundera. Or if Sartre or Freud was becoming available, there was an excitement about ideas, about possibilities. There was a great deal of idealism that was very charming. And that, I think, has been subsumed by a consumerism which is really all pervasive. Again, understandable against the background of so much poverty for so long. I think people in any country would walk that route.
Some people describe that process differently. Some suggest it was from naivete to a more matured attitude. Others describe it as from more spiritual to much more materialistic. Of course, the latter tends to be negative, while the former tend to be more exciting. Do you think any of these that you would like to subscribe to? It's a mixture of...
Sure, it's a mixture. They're both legitimate. If you say from naivete to maturity, yes, there was obviously an element of naivete when the country had been so closed off for so long. So, and you could also describe it as simply going from, poverty to increasing wealth, and that's a very good thing for the Chinese. But if we stop there, then we are saying that all interest in literature, philosophy, spiritual matters, cultural matters is by definition naive, or we consign it to poverty. And I don't believe that. In fact, that description would fly in the face of the great cultural traditions of China. So I think that this consumerist phase is an inevitable but also passing phase. And I remain fairly confident that China will move through it to a rediscovery and a mixture of interest in the cultural, the spiritual matters, all the things you described, as well as being a developed country that is more sophisticated, more mature. I don't think there's any contradiction there.
That put us to another question, which is for China hand like you, if I could use this adjective, China hand like you. It's a very interesting experience, I would assume. On the one hand, you need to observe, you need to understand, analyze, and to a certain extent embrace whatever is happening in this country. On the other hand, you also serve as a bridge of communication. You have to explain to the Americans what China is about, whether you like it or not.
Right, that's right.
And sometimes you will be misconcepted by the others as a guardian of China or a propaganda tool of China. The other way around as well. You will be regarded by the Chinese as explaining the American way and looking at China always from a superior perspective.
Right.
What is it like for you guys? Someone who in this very delicate situation.
Well, I think first one has to remain fairly humble and remember that both the United States and China are vastly complex, rapidly changing places that no one can understand. I don't understand my own country. People say, oh, you understand China. Well, of course I don't understand China. My Chinese friends don't understand China in a meaningful way.
They just live it.
I don't understand America. They just live it. So one way is to narrow one's focus and to be very careful. But if you narrow one's focus and only speak about something highly specific, the South China Sea, the economy, then you miss the broad historical and cultural context. But the broad historical and cultural context is also too vast to absorb. So it's really trying to remember that China's changing, that America's changing, and you only muddle through. We all muddle through.
How could you sharpen your senses? How could you make sure your understanding about China as close as it could be?
So you have to read Chinese writers. And fortunately, it's possible to do that because of the internet. You have different sources where it's possible to read some of the people who are sort of more on the left side, who are very strongly supportive of the government or nationalistic. You need to read what they say and understand their arguments. But you also need to read people on the other side as well. And I think that this is one of the things, you ask what China Hands can do. I think that if they try to stay on top of what the Chinese themselves are debating, and that's very difficult, they can help Americans understand Chinese views of China. And that's one of the things I try to do at the Kissinger Institute, the Wilson Center where I work, is not to say this is correct, that's wrong, China is this, America should do that, but to help Americans understand how Chinese feel about the directions China is taking. That, I think, is doable if you stay on top of it.
All right. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.